In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on variables.
All variables have what we call a scope. So what is the scope of a variable? Well, the scope just simply tells us where a variable is visible or accessible. In other words, we're asking the question, where can we use the variable? And in Visual Basic, there are a couple of cases that we have to consider, and it comes down to where do we actually declare a variable? So we got to consider variables that are declared inside of a particular method, and we also need to consider variables that are declared outside of any and all methods. So what happens to these variables? When are they visible? We'll first consider the case of a variable that is declared inside of a method. In this particular case, these variables can only be used and accessed within that method. In other words, we cannot access these variables outside of that variable. There is an actual name for these types of variables. We call them local variables. And the reason why we say local is because anything that's declared within a method is considered local. That's just part of the definition. So if I declare a variable inside of a method, I can only use that variable inside of that method, because once that method is done, everything that's been allocated is freed up, so it's no longer used. So anything outside of that method won't be able to access that variable because it's not going to be allocated in our memory. So variables declared inside of methods can only be used and accessed within that method. Now, what about the variables that are declared outside of methods? So yes, we can allow variables to be declared outside of all the methods. However, they still have to be declared inside of a class. Everything is inside of a class. You're not allowed to declare stuff outside of a class. That's just part of the rules of object-oriented programming. Now, these variables also have a particular name. These are what we call global variables. So any variable that is declared outside of all the methods is what's called a global variable. Now, the scope for these variables is that they can be accessed anywhere. So if I declare a global variable, it can be accessed by any method within that same class. Now, different classes, that's a whole other story that we'll get into a little bit. But within the given class, all methods can access any and all global variables. Now, global variables of a class have another name. They're called instance variables. We talked a little bit before if you took CS 121 with the Java course as well. And the reason why they're called instance variables is because let's say we have several objects of the same class. Each object is going to have its own set of the same variables. We say it has an instance of those same variables. And with these variables, the values that are stored in each of these instance variables can very well be different from each other. So like, for example, let's say I have two objects of a particular class, and maybe I have some instance variable, I'm just going to call it x. So both of these objects are going to have an x with it, but the values stored in both of these x variables can be different. I can have one object where the value of x is 5. I can have my other object have the x value in there store a 3. So these x variables, these instance variables, are independent of all the different objects. Now, with these instance variables, they can be public or private. Private instance variables cannot be directly accessed from any other class. So if I were to create several objects of a class and the instance variables in these objects are private, I can't have an object access an instance variable of another class. As we've already mentioned in Visual Basic, the instance variables or variables in general are private by default. So we can make them public, but because they're initially private, no other object, no other class can access that particular variable. Only the methods and other features of that particular object within can access that particular instance variables. Now, if we were to set it to public, then those instance variables that are set to public can be accessed by other classes, and it can be done by using an instance of the class. So I could have an object of a different class, and I could access a public variable of some other class. Let's do an example of some code and actually see how these scope rules apply. So in this example, I have two methods, method 1 and method 2. In method 1, I declare a string variable called pname, and it's initialized to hello. And then I use a message box to print the value of pname. So it's going to print hello in a message box. And then in method 2, I'm pretty much doing the same thing, except I'm not declaring pname. I'm going to display the value of pname. So we need to ask ourselves, is this going to work? Does this code work without any problems? Take a second to think about it. Pause the video if you need to. And when you have the answer, resume and you can see if you're correct or not. So let's take a look at pname first. So we see that it is a local variable of method 1 because we see that it's being declared right here. There's pname, it's being declared, and it's declared in method 1. Since it is a local variable, that means it can only be used inside of the method that declared it. So in this case, pname cannot be accessed by any other method. This includes method 2. So we see we're trying to access pname right here in method 2, but because it is a local variable for method 1, we're not allowed to do this. So if we were to try to write up this code and then run it, we're going to see that this does not work. So we're not allowed to do this. Now let's try this example. So we're doing the same thing. At least we're trying to do the same thing. We still have pname, and it's going to store the string hello. And in both method 1 and method 2, we're going to display a message box that says hello or whatever is stored in pname. So let's ask ourselves the question, does this work? So pause the video, take a minute to think it over, and once you think you have the answer, resume the video and see if you're correct. So let's look at where pname is now. So notice that we're declaring it right here. It's not declared inside of any method. This means that pname is now a global variable, not a local variable. And if we remember the scope rules, global variables can be accessed by any method inside the class. This means that pname can be accessed by all methods. That includes method 1, so where we're using it right here is perfectly fine, and it includes method 2, where we use pname right here. So this code will work. Here is a slightly different example. So we still have pname declared, and we're still going to have message boxes that display whatever is stored in pname. I want to ask you two questions. First, does this code work? And second, if it does, what does this program do? So take a minute to pause the video, look over the code, and see if you can get an idea of what's going on here. So first we need to see what's going on with pname. So we see that it is declared right here. So it's outside of any method. That means that pname is a global variable. And that means by the scope rules, pname can be accessed by all methods. So it can be accessed by method 1 and can be accessed by method 2. So we see that we're using pname in method 1 here, right here, and we see that pname is being used in method 2 right here. This is no different than what we saw in the last example. So this code is going to work. Now, the question we need to ask is, what is this program going to do? Because notice that where we declare pname, we're not initializing it. It's not initialized at all. So that means by default, it's going to be null. So what's going to happen? Well, in method 1, notice that we have this line right here. If I can draw the line, we have this line right here, where we assign the string hello to pname. So what that means is in method 1, we're going to display whatever is stored in pname, which is going to be hello. So when we run method 1, we will display hello because in that method, pname has the value hello. Now, what about method 2? Well, hello is no longer going to be stored in there because method 2 is going to take whatever pname is outside of the methods. So what that means is at this point, there's nothing in pname. That hello is only valid inside of method 1. What that means is when we display the message box and print it, we're not going to get anything. I'm not even going to say it's the empty string. You may think it's the empty string, but it's not going to be even the empty string because pname stores null, so nothing gets displayed. Let's do one more example. So here's our code. We're changing a couple things here. So we're going to ask ourselves, first, is this code going to work? And second, what does the program do? So pause the video, take a look at it, and resume when you think you have the answer. So let's take a look at what's going on with pname. So it's being declared right here. So that means it is a global variable. So according to our scope rules, that means it can be accessed by all the methods. So we see that pname is being used here and here. No different than the examples we've seen so far. So this code should work. Now let's look at what's actually going on in here. So notice that when we declare pname, we're initializing it to the value, or I should say the string, yes. So that means any method that we go into, pname is initially yes. Let's go into method 1. Well, in method 1, we have our same line from the last example where we're assigning the string hello to pname, which means inside this method, pname becomes hello. So when I print pname, I'm going to print the string hello. This is no different than what we did in the last example. Now let's look at method 2. So here, we're not changing anything in pname. So that means when we call this method, pname is initially yes, which means when we display the value of pname, it's going to take whatever is currently stored in there, which is yes. So therefore, method 2 is going to display the string yes.